So that may be boring for some, but I'm going to try and move it along very rapidly, not go into a huge amount of depth on any one thing, but give you an overview that will hopefully allow you to then, piece these things together for yourselves and do more research as you like.
And I should say, by the way, Albert is very modest. He's actually has a Ph.D. in information technology from MIT, so he could be speaking all the way up here. So it's nice that he could.
So the first thing I want everybody to do is get on a Wi-Fi network. There's a link to this. Is the Wi-Fi network here. You're not actually going to need it all the time, but you'll need it for some of the time. So I just want to make sure everybody can get on the internet. So the first thing I want to know or talk about very briefly is when you fire up a web browser and you type a domain into the browser, like DailyLit, I'm going to talk very briefly about what the computer actually does behind the scenes a little bit, because that's really the starting point for all of the stuff that happens on the internet. If you want to go someplace and you type a domain name into your browser. So the computer doesn't actually understand these words. It doesn't know what CNN is. It doesn't know what Google is. These are just words, right? So the very first thing it needs to do is turn this into a number, and it needs to turn it into a number that's the IP address. It's the place of the server that it wants to get to. And so when you register a name like DailyLit or whatever domain names your companies have, all you're doing is you're reserving that name so that nobody can else have that name. But it doesn't actually tell any of those computers where to go to. So the first step is you register the name, and you do that with a registrar.
Hold on a second. Can we move away a little bit so we can get a little room there?
The second thing you need to do is you need to have a server someplace that can act as the server for your content. So for instance, DailyLit gets served up from someplace in Texas. We've never been there. Most of the content that gets served up on the internet today gets served up from servers that very few people have ever seen. They're in some data center. We've never seen this machine. It's been just plugging away by itself. But the thing that needs to happen in order for your web browser from your local computer here to be able to connect to that server somewhere in Texas is this first step of taking the word dailylit.com and translating it into a number, which is the IP address. And so the way that happens is through a system that's called DNS. And DNS stands for Domain Name System, or Domain Name Service. And what it does is it lets your local computer say, hey, where in the world is Carmen San Diego? Where in the world is the DailyLit server? And it gets back a number, and that's the number that's like much more like a phone number. So you can think of DNS like a phone book. So DNS is like a gigantic phone book in the sky that takes domain names and translates them into telephone numbers, except that the telephone numbers on the internet are called IP addresses. And IP stands for Internet Protocol. So that's the very first step. The first step in going to any website is that your browser needs to turn the domain name into the IP address. So there are actually services out there that let you look up where a particular domain is at. So I'm going to end at dailylit.com here, and it's going to show a number of things once this comes up. Yeah, so for those of you who just came in, I'm just explaining the most basic thing that gives you some context. So I don't just want to talk about HTML, I want to talk about, give you some whole overview of kind of how the internet works, and then HTML will be one part of that. So what I was saying is when you type a domain name into your browser, the first thing your browser needs to do is it needs to look up what the server is that has that content on it. And so this is very similar to you going to the telephone book and looking up somebody's telephone number, except that what your web browser does, it relies on a service called DNS, which is distributed across the entire internet, and it lets it turn a name like CNN.com or HarperCollins.com and turn that into a number. And what I've done here is I've actually not just turned it into a number, and you can see that the DailyLit server is at a number that's 72.32.133.224. That's a weird way of writing the telephone number, but that it sort of looks like a telephone number. That is called an IP address. And every server on the internet has one of these addresses, and it uniquely identifies that server. The other thing that this thing shows is that in order for your browser to get from here to that server, it actually goes through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 intermediate machines. Okay? So every time you hit the DailyLit webpage from here, the content actually flows through 9 intermediate nodes in order to get here. Still gets here pretty damn fast, actually. So now we've just covered step 1. So step 1 is use DNS to find IP address. That's what your browser does. Step 2, your browser does something called an HTTP request. See, there are going to be a lot of acronyms tonight. So HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And that was the thing that made the web possible. The internet existed long before the web. The web is something that exists on top of the internet. The HTTP request is your browser now taking that number that it discovered and saying, please give me your HTML content. That's what this request is. And that request brings a few things along with it from your browser. Your browser is going to say, I'm a Firefox browser, or I'm Internet Explorer, or I'm an iPhone. It's also going to say, I am calling from this IP address. The browser, am located at this specific IP address. It's also going to say things like, I got here by clicking on a link that's called the refer. Obviously, when you just type dailylit.com into your browser, there's no refer, so it's not going to send one along. But all of these pieces of information get sent along with the HTTP request. So the client, by client, just to throw out a few more terms, client is what we call our individual computers. Server is what we call the computers that provide the content. So it sends along the client IP, it sends along what browser you're using, browser type. It actually sends a lot more information like your screen resolution, etc. But I'll only talk about the most important ones. And it sends along the referrer. So let's do such an HTTP request, and let's all go right now for a moment to a site that we've set up for this purpose for tonight, and it's just called Penelope Sparks.
It's a combination of my dog and cat.
So, you should all be getting this very simple welcome to DailyLit HTML training screen. So one of the great things, great things about learning about the internet is that it's all actually very, very transparent. That is, you can at all times look at what's behind the door, so to speak. So one of the things, depending on what browser you use,